Chapter 5 of These Are the Voyages, Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in the 1970s, Volume 1, 1970 to 1975. Chapter 5, Star Trek in Syndication, The Start of a Phenomenon, 1969 to 72. On March 24, 1969, full-page Paramount ads in industry trade newspapers announced, "Takeoff with Star Trek." NBC had all rights to the series through Tuesday, September 9th, when the last network broadcast, Requiem for Methuselah, was scheduled. But for any eager syndicators, the show was available as early as the very next day. The ad boasted that the series was now being seen in 65 countries around the world. On July 12th, that number climbed to 66. The Stage and Television Today, a London, England-based trade, reported in its June 5, 1969 issue, quote, "Star Trek, the American series described as the best science fiction series yet produced on television, will replace Doctor Who on Saturday evening on BBC One from July 12th. A character with large pointed ears is one of the stars of the new space adventure series. Called Mr. Spock, he is half human and half Vulcanian. He is played by Leonard Nimoy. Star Trek was given 5 Emmy nominations in its first year in America. The Smithsonian Institute asked for the pilot program for its space museum, and scientists from the RAND Corporation act as consultants for the series. The series is notable for its attention to detail and technical accuracy. It is set 100 years from now, aboard a deep space cruiser exploring strange new worlds on the edges of the known universe. Mr. Spock, the ship's second officer, has become one of the cult characters of American television." End quote. Another full-page ad was placed by Paramount in Variety on July 14, 1969. The studio boasted, quote, "In terms of national and international viewers of TV and the market share captured, Star Trek is really out of this world. The ARB Network Program Analysis, Spring 1968, reveals that in the 61 domestic markets, Star Trek had a share of 30 or more. The average share of Star Trek for these markets was 39.5. Get your share of the world aboard the Enterprise." End quote. WPIX Channel 11, with its transmitter on the Empire State Building in New York City, was the first station in America to air Star Trek in syndication. The date, Wednesday, September 10th, from 6 to 7 p.m., was less than 24 hours after NBC's final broadcast of the series. Star Trek would be stripped Monday through Friday. WPIX's signal covered all of New York State and could also be picked up in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. WKBD Channel 50, Detroit, Michigan, was next, kicking off airings on Saturday, September 13th from 7 to 8 p.m. weekly. By Monday, September 15th, the series began stripping on nearly 100 stations from coast to coast, with more joining the ranks as each 3-month ratings cycle passed. Variety reported on October 8th, quote, "That whimsical Nielsen family is providing the TV industry with all the real-life hard cash drama it can tolerate. And that's not only on the national scene, but also in Videoland's #1 market, where mighty Metro Media is for the first time facing genuine competition on the independent ratings line." So far in the new season, the independent competition is so fierce in the pivotal 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. slot that the 3 indies are racking up a greater share of audience in the half hour before prime time than the 3 networks O&Os, owned and operated, with national news shows. In previous seasons, WNEW-TV had the network numbers needle all to itself, with the Lucy regrinds programmed to counter the O&Os with news. Now WPIX-TV's fresh off-web stripping of Star Trek 6:30 to 7:30, and WOR-TV's fresh off-web Dick Van Dyke sitcom, 7 to 7:30, are piling on the numbers and shares." End quote. The I Love Lucy reruns on Metromedia's independent station WNEW had beat the three networks with their evening news broadcasts for a few years. The other two New York City area independent stations, WOR and WPIX, had never come close enough to be in the race. Now, with Star Trek, and to a lesser degree the Dick Van Dyke Show, they were challenging both Network News and WNEW's offering of Lucy. On October 22nd, Variety had the Nielsen numbers. CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, 24 share. I Love Lucy, 22 share. Star Trek, 19 share. Huntley-Brinkley Report, NBC, 19 share. The Dick Van Dyke Show, 9 share. The remaining 6% of the viewing audience was split between the ABC Evening News with Frank Reynolds and Howard K. Smith and Antiques on PBS. Ironically, the series NBC had just dropped was tying its evening news broadcast in the Big Apple, where the network's corporate offices were located. Paramount capitalized on the year-end ratings reports from New York and elsewhere, with a series of full-page ads in Broadcasting and Variety. For the time periods in which the various independents carried Star Trek in major markets, the studio bragged. New York, WPIX up 96%. Chicago, WGN up 40%. Los Angeles, KCOP up 77%. Minneapolis-St. Paul rating up 44%. Providence over lead-in up 30%. Las Vegas share up 31%. Greensboro, Winston-Salem adult viewers up to 50%. In market after market, Star Trek was turning losing stations into winners. Star Trek was also proving an oasis in a dry desert of video mediocrity. Television was changing, and not necessarily for the better. Consumer watchdog groups had bullied the Federal Communications Commission to tighten the screws on TV networks in an effort to rid the small screen of violence. Dramatic series perceived by the self-appointed regulators as blatantly violent, such as Star Trek, I Spy, The Avengers, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Rat Patrol, Combat, and The Wild Wild West, were now absent from network schedules. Hawaii Five-0 had been threatened too, but rather than cancel the series, CBS pushed it back to a 10 to 11 p.m. time slot. TV westerns were on their way out too, primarily due to their inherent violence. The genre had its heyday in the late 1950s to mid-60s, when nearly 50% of the primetime series were oters, with body counts that seemingly equaled the population of the United States. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Lancer, and the Virginian were left standing, but the amount of saloon brawls and gunplay were minimized at the expense of story, character, and excitement. For those of us raised on the thrills and colors of the 1960s, TV was suddenly looking very dull, except in syndicated reruns, and Star Trek was quickly replacing I Spy as the most popular hour-long series being stripped. "Funny thing," said Dorothy Fontana. "I noticed one time as I traveled about California on business that I saw the same Star Trek episode in the same week in San Diego, San Francisco, and then at home in L.A. I forget now which one it was, but it was one I knew well. At the time, the local station editors could edit the episodes as they chose, usually for time. The episode I saw 3 times in 3 different cities was cut differently in each one of them." In September 1969, Gold Key published Star Trek comic number 5, Ghost Planet. Parent company Western Publishing had no intention of dropping the title just because the series had ceased production. To the contrary, with the show going into earlier time periods on independent stations across the nation, and airing up to 5 times a week in many markets, Western Gold Key was predicting a Star Trek boon. This was demonstrated a mere 2 months later in December 1969, when the company published Star Trek comic number 6, When Planets Collide. Sales were up, so 3 months later, in March 1970, Gold Key rush-released Star Trek comic number 7, The Voodoo Planet. At this time, Bantam Books published the second original Star Trek novel, after a long gap since the 1968 issuing of the Four Youngsters' Mission to Horatius by Mac Reynolds. The new book, a Bantam paperback, was Spock Must Die, from science fiction author James Blish. The British writer had already done well with his adaptations of Star Trek scripts in short story form, featured in the anthologies Star Trek 1967, Star Trek II 1968, and Star Trek III 1969. This trend continued, with each new release outselling previous ones. September 1970, Star Trek comic number 8, The Youth Trap, hit the newsstands and quickly sold out. February 1970, Star Trek comic number 9, The Legacy of Lazarus, was in bookstores and comic book spinners in grocery and drugstores. Sales became so brisk that Gold Key now released a new Star Trek comic every 3 to 4 months. And Paramount, by contractual arrangement, was seeing gold. In July 1971, Star Trek IV, the next James Blish collection adapted from the TV scripts, was published by Bantam Books. Over the next few years, the publisher issued 8 more volumes. In April 1971, Dick Kleiner wrote in a syndicated newspaper article, quote, "One series that is missed, perhaps more than any other, is Star Trek, that brilliant science fiction program. Its creator and producer, Gene Roddenberry, has gone into features, and wrote and produced the new Rock Hudson film, Pretty Maids All in a Row. Roddenberry says there may be a Star Trek feature movie, and he'd like to do it." End quote. But, Roddenberry told Kleiner, the studio owns it. It seems incredible that a man can create something and not own it, but that's the way it is. What I hope to do is get the financial point where I can buy it back. Meanwhile, Pretty Maids came and went. Hardly a failure, but neither a great success. Star Trek entered its 3rd year of syndication. Roddenberry was becoming steadily more famous thanks to his attention-grabbing opening title sequence credit, Star Trek created by Gene Roddenberry. Every time the Enterprise whooshed past the camera and Roddenberry's name flew onto the screen, his future became more tied to Star Trek. Even so, there was still no money from Paramount. Roddenberry, quote, "My dreams were going downhill because I could not get work after the original series was canceled. I was stereotyped as a science fiction writer, and sometimes it was tough to pay the mortgage. They said, 'You're a science fiction type.' I said, 'Hey, wait a minute, I used to write westerns. I wrote police stories.' And they said, 'No, you're now science fiction.'" End quote. It seems an absurd assumption. Being a producer on Star Trek didn't stop Gene Coon from finding work outside of science fiction genre. He moved directly from Star Trek back to Universal, where he had helped develop McHale's Navy and The Munsters. The studio kept him busy writing a couple of feature films, then serving as showrunner on It Takes a Thief. And Bob Justman's work in science fiction, which spanned 5 years between The Outer Limits and Star Trek, didn't stop him from becoming showrunner on the contemporary drama There Came Bronson. Like Coon, it was Justman's good reputation in the industry and strong relationship with Herb Solow, as well as MGM, that led to quick reemployment. Star Trek 3rd season producer Fred Freiberger bounced back fast, with writing assignments on All in the Family and Emergency. In 1972, he was hired as a creative executive to develop and write for various animation series at Hanna-Barbera. Roddenberry, however, by engaging in constant battles with his studio and network and complaining to the press about executives at Paramount and NBC, had tarnished his reputation within the television industry. Roddenberry, either not able or not willing to accept that there were people in Hollywood who just didn't want to work with him, continued to blame branding as his biggest obstacle. Labeled the sci-fi guy, he told the press, That's the way Hollywood is, and that's the way mediocre people think. After statements like this, it was unlikely that the mediocre people running the studios, networks, and TV series were going to give Gene Roddenberry any work, unless they needed him. After all, he had created television's most successful science fiction series thus far, or, for that matter, of all time. But in the fall of 1971, no one was making science fiction. In search of income, Roddenberry hit the lecture circuit, talking about the only thing that anyone wanted to hear him talk about, Star Trek. He said, "I remember one of my first speeches. I got all of $600 or $700, which included the cost of the trip. I felt lucky to net the $400 or $500 that they paid me." In December 1971, while in the midst of a handful of college lectures, Roddenberry received a 3-day appearance offer from an unlikely source, something that had never happened before. Variety covered the event on its front page for January 19, 1972, with the title, "Star Trek Conclave in New York Looms as Mix of Campy Set and Sci-Fi Buffs." Staff reporter Frank Bierman wrote, in part, quote, "How quickly they forget is not a statement that can be made of fans of NBC's old series Star Trek. The demise of the sci-fi skein in 1969 brought some bitter attacks on the network, mostly from high school and college students. But it was off the schedule that fall nonetheless. It has continued in syndication, of course, and even now is airing in 100 or so markets in the U.S. and more than 70 overseas. And now, the first convention of Star Trek fans is about to be held in New York. So far, there is an advance registration of over 700, and 1,500 to 2,000 are expected to show up for the bash, which will run this weekend, January 21st to 23rd, at the Statler Hilton." End quote. And I'll read a poster that there's a picture of in the book. "Star Trek Lives, a Star Trek Convention, January 21 to 23, 1972, at the Statler Hilton, 33rd Street and 7th Avenue, New York City. Everybody welcome." For information, Star Trek Con, P.O. Box 95, Old Chelsea Station, New York, New York 10011. Late Flash. Gene Roddenberry will speak early Saturday afternoon. Along with Roddenberry, featured speakers included Isaac Asimov, Dorothy Fontana, and former Desilu executive Oscar Katz. NASA was there too. Variety reported that the space agency would set up a large display of lunar module and space unit mock-ups. Paramount provided 15 episodes and a blooper reel. A good time was guaranteed for all. Joan Winston, a highly visible fan of the original series and contributor to the Star Trek fanzines of the late 1960s, was one of the organizers of the event, along with Al Schuster, Elise Pine, Alum Asherman, and Stu Hollinger. It wasn't the first get-together of Star Trek fans dubbed a convention, but those, such as the one in Los Angeles in 1970, had been smaller affairs, usually totaling a few hundred attendees due to venue size and limited promotion. This time would be different. The organizers of Star Trek Lives had planned for 400, based on fans they were in contact with who expressed interest in standing. The admission fee was $3.50. By the end of the first day, more than 1,200 attendees had already been crowded in the room, filling it beyond capacity. Soon ABC and CBS had film crews on the scene, as well as reporters from numerous local chapters. TV Guide was there, too. For the 1975 Bantam paperback, also titled Star Trek Lives, Joan Winston recalled, quote, "The crush was so great the ABC crew was taking pictures of the CBS crew, taking pictures of the ABC crew, taking pictures of the CBS crew, because nobody could move. It was strange that the only major network not represented was NBC, the network that had carried Star Trek in the first place. They claimed to be completely disinterested, but we heard later that they sent down some people to take a look. They walked in Saturday afternoon, took a look, turned ashen and left. I think that they were afraid that if anyone found out they were from the network that canceled Star Trek, they might have been lynched." End quote. Regarding Gene Roddenberry and Majel Barrett's arrival, Winston said, quote, "Unfortunately, the kids at the reception desk were not familiar enough with the in-person appearances to recognize them. So when Gene and Majel attempted to walk into the dealer's room, one of the kids asked to see their badges. You can't come in here without a badge unless you are a member of the committee or connected with Star Trek." Gene's response was classic. "I am Star Trek," he announced, sweeping theatrically past the stunned group. End quote. Winston remembered hearing Roddenberry, after several hours of wandering through the convention and meeting the fans, comment, "I just don't believe it, all these great people coming here to honor Star Trek." Quote, "I know Gene Roddenberry and I were both flabbergasted by the turnout of enthusiastic, intelligent fans, so happy to hear what we had to say, eager to get autographs, etc.," Dorothy Fontana said. "They inundated the hotel completely for the entire time the con was scheduled. Now, we knew we had a strong fan following because of the mail received, still coming into Paramount to be forwarded on to Lincoln Enterprises for handling." And Lincoln Enterprises was still doing a big business in souvenirs, photos, etc., but seeing that many actual people at the con, so deeply involved 3 years after the original episodes were off the air and only reruns available, touched all of us involved, and made us glad that we had done as much as we had to entertain our fans." End quote. Gene Winston said, quote, "Gene and Majel were mobbed everywhere they went. They were just delighted, and everyone adored them." End quote. The question most frequently asked was, "Will Star Trek come back on the air?" Gene replied patiently and repeatedly that he didn't think a series would, but that a movie was a distinct possibility. "I didn't think so last week, but after this convention I think that anything is possible." In an interview with author Joel Engel, Winston said, quote, "Gene enjoyed the living daylights out of himself, and Majel was so thrilled. The morning after the first night, when they woke up in the hotel room, Gene reached over to kiss her, and she said, 'Don't touch me, I'm a star.'" End quote. While the convention was still taking place, Anthony Burton wrote for the January 22, 1972 issue of New York Daily News, quote, "If you didn't already know it, Star Trek lives, Captain Kirk, and that redoubtable Vulcan, Mr. Spock, and Bones are still hurtling around the galaxy on the Starship Enterprise, powered by the admiration of fans still besotted by the old TV show. Hundreds upon hundreds of kids proved it yesterday when they descended on the Statler Hilton for the first Star Trek convention, chattering eagerly about the exploits of their space heroes. It was the first full-scale appearance of the Star Trek subculture that has grown up around a show now seen only in reruns. Co-organizer Al Schuster said he knew of at least 30 Star Trek clubs around the country. The fans are mostly high school and college kids, he said, although some people in their mid-30s are bananas about the show. And here's a letter from an 8-year-old Brooklynite who digs it." End quote. On February 16, 1972, Kathy Calvert filed a report for the Monmouth College Oracle, quote, "Nearly 2,000 devotees of the television program Star Trek filled New York's Statler Hilton January 21st to 23rd with talk of Trekkies, tribbles, and phasers. Activities got off to a flying start when guest of honor Gene Roddenberry, originator and executive producer of Star Trek, was greeted by a standing ovation and then nearly mobbed by the crowd. He spoke of the possibility of Star Trek's return to the screen and of its message to its fans. Quote, "This human biped thing, this strange creature who's awkward, vain, and weak, damn it, you're gorgeous, and we love you." End quote, end quote. Roddenberry would make better speeches in the future. For a man resembling a deer caught in headlights, he was doing the best he could. Calvert concluded, quote, "Fan power which influenced Congress has yet to triumph over NBC, the network that carried and canceled Star Trek. Yet Roddenberry reports network interest, particularly as new demographics show Star Trekkers to be a quality audience. Star Trek Con was an impressive show of strength. End quote. From the March 25, 1972 issue of TV Guide, William Marsano wrote, quote, all over the country today, people are wearing Star Trek Lives t-shirts, pasting Star Trek bumper stickers on their cars, and maybe, for all I know, falling on their knees before graven images of Mr. Spock. Why? Well, because back at the end of January, Star Trek's fanatic band of fans held their first national convention, nearly 3 years after the series was shot out of orbit by NBC. Star Trek's fans, as loyal as always and more numerous than ever, easily filled and overfilled an entire floor of New York's Statler Hilton Hotel. The main attraction was the Trading Post, which was bursting with nostalgia dealers and small knots of Trekkies surging about with eyes glazed and elbows flailing. Most of the items offered related to Star Trek, and many of them focused on Mr. Spock, Star Trek's most popular hero. The selection ranged from Spock wooden nickels and lapel pins proclaiming, I grok Mr. Spock, to Spock prints, Spock calendars, $1 each, and handmade Spock plaster busts for $11.99. There were also Star Trek publicity photographs and tape recordings, scripts to be auctioned, individual frames of Star Trek scenes rescued from the cutting room floor, and snapshots of the series taken off TV sets. End quote. There had never been anything like it. Hotel staff were stunned. Media people were stunned. Even those who organized the convention were stunned, and now words were introduced into the popular culture, such as con and Trekkies. A new subculture had been born, one that would one day give birth to comic cons, alien cons, you name it cons. No one knew it yet. This frenzy was just an oddity, a passing fad, like Elvis, like the Beatles, like Star Trek. Nancy B. Roberts of New Hampshire's The Portsmouth Herald was also on hand and wrote in the newspaper's March 28th edition, quote, various fan souvenirs were for sale at the convention, including amateur fan magazines about Star Trek, Trek zines, film clippings, photos, scripts, and other items such as tribbles, small furry animals that purr, introduced in a Star Trek episode. Uniforms and gadgets such as phasers and tricorders were on display. There was also an art show of professional and semi-professional works on science fiction and Star Trek. Star Trek fans saw films of episodes, including one show titled The Cage that had never been shown on TV, but was later expanded into another episode, The Menagerie. Outtakes, or Star Trek bloopers, parts of films that had to be cut out because of actors' mistakes, were shown. Speakers included Isaac Asimov, science fiction writer, and Gene Roddenberry, creator of the series. Also present was Majel Barrett, a Star Trek actress. End quote. From today's vantage point, these writers come across like tour guides of exotic lands, ready to explain every outlandish trait of the natives to gaping tourists. Note that Robert felt she had to explain what a tribble was, and even what a blooper was, more than 10 years before TV's Bloopers and Practical Jokes, from Dick Clark Productions and NBC in 1984, and many imitators over the years, made all of America familiar with the word. Roddenberry recalled, quote, you couldn't help but get caught up in the enthusiasm radiating in those rooms. The energy was completely positive. Now, when people are packed together like that, tempers can flare, but not at that convention. And you understood that this was not a one-time event. You could pick that up from the enthusiasm, the sincere joy coming off those young people. This was only the beginning, the start of something not seen before. It was a delightful experience. I expect it meant as much to Majel and myself as anyone else there. End quote. Joan Winston said, despite cancellation, we had produced concrete proof of Star Trek's long-term viability. Our cozy little con had become the biggest science fiction convention in history. While in New York for this first ever Star Trek convention, Roddenberry also met with those ashen-faced NBC people. He met with some CBS people, too, having been invited to both networks' New York offices to discuss ideas for more series. Before leaving the Big Apple, Roddenberry wrote to Betty Ballantine. The writer, editor, and publisher, along with husband Ian Ballantine, had founded Bantam Books in 1945 and Ballantine Books in 1952. Ballantine had published The Making of Star Trek, and Bantam was now publishing the James Blish Star Trek paperbacks. Roddenberry told Betty Ballantine that he had been, quote, discussing a horror series with CBS, eventually realized as Spectre, and some kind of sci-fi setup with NBC. My preference is the latter case. It would be something like doing the NBC Sci-Fi Movie of the Week, which could be used to pilot sci-fi series. At least it would be the kind of thing which would bring me back to TV with a glad cry, and I will let you know if anything materializes, as you may have books you would like to suggest." End quote. It would never materialize, and it took another 4 years for Spectre to see the light of a TV screen, on a different network than CBS. What the two networks really wanted with Roddenberry was a little brain-picking. Did he have anything else up his sleeve like Star Trek? And if not, what about Star Trek itself? On February 11, 1972, responding to a fan letter, Roddenberry wrote, quote, "Will Star Trek come back? Until a year ago, or even a few months ago, my answer to this question was always a strong negative. Paramount and NBC did not seem that interested, and the whole problem of bringing the original actors together again, locating key crew members, replacing practically all of the sets and props which had been largely destroyed by Paramount, seemed much too complex and too expensive. And, to be frank, I was certain that fan enthusiasm would soon level off and begin dropping. Well, it didn't happen that way. Star Trek continues to break all the established rules and precedents. In some cities, Star Trek reruns are playing to larger and more enthused audiences than when originally aired. Local TV stations, newspaper columnists, Paramount Studios, and NBC continue to be bombarded with fan queries and demands regarding the show's return. The unprecedented Star Trek convention in New York in January, which expected an attendance of 600 and drew almost 3,000, stunned all three networks. It also resulted in NBC finally admitting that they had probably canceled Star Trek too quickly, and asking me if I would be interested in the return of Star Trek. Now, it's important to understand that a query of this sort is not a contract, and there are many complications during which the network's interest could cool. But it has changed my answer to the question, will Star Trek come back? I think it is now possible that it can. A lot of that will depend on the continuing level of fan interest, and probably also on whether there will be continuing fan pressure on NBC to jibe them back a series they want." End quote. In mid-March 1972, after returning to Los Angeles, Roddenberry wrote to a friend, quote, "Things are beginning to move fast for me here. Most exciting of all, NBC has thrown in the towel and announced it wants Star Trek back on the air. Whether or not a deal with them and with Paramount, who own it with me, is possible is hard to say at this time. But it seems to me that the thing now has a sort of momentum which will tend to push through such obstacles. Also, I am discussing a horror tale pilot for CBS and have 2 animation projects which look promising. It's like all of a sudden everyone in town wants me to do something, or so it seems." End quote. The momentum continued to grow. On April 17th, he responded to Robert Olson, a fan who had written, quote, "Dear Robert, thank you for your kind letter. You may be sure Star Trek is very near to my heart, too, and I would enjoy producing new episodes. NBC has informed me that they are interested in having it back on the air, so the ultimate decision must be made by Paramount Studios, who own the basic rights to the idea. What is required now is for Paramount to make equitable offers to myself and the others involved, and to indicate to us we will have the time and facilities to make the show with the same quality and care." End quote. At this time, Roddenberry wrote to science fiction author Hal Clement, also known as Harry Stubbs, a Star Trek fan whom he had met earlier in the year at that first Star Trek convention in New York. He said, quote, "We did have one meeting with NBC after returning to the West Coast, and at least one comment from it will probably amuse you. The executive ventured the opinion, we probably canceled Star Trek too soon. Is that what one calls a Pyrrhic victory? I think I would rather have the checks for the 5-year run." End quote. Roddenberry and Clement continued to correspond. In his next letter, Roddenberry said, quote, "You will be interested to know that NBC has queried me directly about putting the show back on the air. Apparently, the president of the network has ordered the program department to look into it and do what they can. The problem is that Paramount Studios owns the basic rights to Star Trek, having bought them as part of acquiring Desilu Studios. And the real question is whether Paramount would be willing to put up the kind of investment necessary to put it back on the air properly. And I think you understand why I would insist on doing it right or not at all. I will bear in mind what you say about the cast, although I guess that at this time NBC would want a change in Kirk. Nothing definite on that, but it is a feeling I get when they discuss the findings of their research people on audience attitude toward various actors. Also, I have an idea Bill would resist coming back for various reasons, some of them personal and beyond discussion by anyone but himself. I could go either way on it." End quote. As Spock might say, an intriguing development. Thank you for listening. CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. The new book, A Bantam Paperback. Also, I am discussing a horror the momentum continued to grow in